All right, so continuing on our series of things we saw at Longpoint, we're going to begin talking about the tournaments. And there's probably going to be 3 of these videos. Today, though, we're going to talk about both Ringen, which is the wrestling, and we will talk about Harnischfechten, which is
also called Passage at
Arms, which is wearing full armor. And just kind of talk through what we observed there. Because Ringen is one of those things that it's a good kind of core thing to learn no matter which thing in HEMA you're going to do. In fact, a lot of people suggest that after you kind of learn longsword, you kind of go and you learn how to do grappling and things like that. There are very specific rules for Ringen specifically, but I thought it was really impressive to watch and try to understand how people were approaching those fights, because as a casual observer, if you're sitting back and watching it, it'd be very easy to just be like, I don't know what's going on here. They're butting heads and they're holding onto each other's shoulders and they're leaning in, and suddenly someone gets thrown and you're like, so what actually just happened?
Well, because people kind of call it's called Ringen officially, but then people will refer to it as wrestling. It doesn't really look anything like wrestling. It doesn't look like what I have seen wrestling look like.
And that's not even professional wrestling, right? That's more like the high school style wrestling. And yeah, it is very different. And they are following some very specific rule sets, namely that they can't use moves that aren't in sources. So this is where it gets really interesting in the HEMA world in terms of tournament fighting, because if you're using things that are outside the sources, it's probably not a good idea, even if it's going to make you win, because you're not winning in the proper historical way.
Yeah.
This is like the Indiana Jones thing. When the guy pulls out the sword and starts swinging it around, you don't pull out your gun and shoot him, because yeah, you won the fight, but that wasn't historical.
When they had a conversation about that right before the tournament actually started, one of the judges came out and explained that there was a move that apparently was legal last year that they were no longer allowing this year, and he explained all of the reasoning for it. And that was basically what it came down to, was there isn't anything in the sources that says you can't do it, but there's not anything in the sources that says you should do it, and specifically the sources give a lot of counters that one particular move doesn't align with.
It's a self-sacrificing move, essentially, where you would actually throw the person over your shoulder, but you're actually having to throw yourself on the ground in the process.
Sit down too,
yeah. And basically you put yourself in a weaker position. And while you can get away with it, and it's completely possible and even martially valid, it's not in the sources, and it does result with you on the ground. And of course, the whole point of the wrestling is to get the other person on the ground. So they
had announced this year that particular move was not being allowed, would not be considered legal.
Yeah. And they were also restricting, for obvious reasons, they were restricting moves that could be life-threatening, because in Ringen, in the sources, there are moves that are basically pick the person up and throw them on their neck, breaking their head against the ground, and obviously they're not going to do those things. They have the mats, but that's really it in terms of protective equipment. They're wearing the jackets, very light jackets. But essentially, it just came down to you have the sources, and what it really came down to, honestly looking at it, is there's really only 2 good ways to throw someone. Besides actually just using their own weight against them like you would in something like judo. You can try to trip up their legs. So you'd see them kind of do these leg dance things where they're trying to wrap their leg around the other person's leg to trip them up. And the other one is to reach down and grab their leg and kind of pick them up and throw them. So I really only ever saw 3 real types of throws. There were the leg trips, the leg grabs, and then a basic kind of shoulder or hip throw, which just used the person's weight against them, again, much like you would see in something like judo. But I
noticed at one point that there was, at least once, there was a lot of the spinning and using centrifugal force to get the person off balance, and then you take them to the ground.
Yeah. There were some incredibly good throws, especially, I think, in the finals. There were some very, very good throws that we saw. Surprise, surprise, the people who got to the finals were very good fighters. But especially when it came down to the wrestling, there were a couple times that were close calls, people getting thrown off the mats and whatnot. But for the most part, they were really, really clean fights, and I thought it was very impressive. It actually made me want to say, okay, well, I think Ringen is also one of the next things I want to do. This is the problem with going to Longpoint, is
everything is
so
interesting,
easy. Yeah,
and
so
therefore
easy.
you suddenly want to learn all of the things.
Yeah, so find a way to rein yourself in, but yeah, it was really interesting, and I think that would be a very fun one to do, because we've been doing dagger fighting, and part of that is throws, so it'd be interesting to kind of build off of that. But and the next thing we saw was the Harnischfechten, and so again, passage of arms, people gearing up in full armor. If you don't know how the pointing is done, pardon the pun, but how the point system is done for this, essentially you're really only trying to get the tip of either the spear or the sword, or whatever you're using in that scenario, into the cracks in the armor. There are points awarded based on whether or not there's chainmail underneath it. So if you're getting gambeson or bare skin or whatever underneath the armor, that's more points, 2 points. If you're only getting mail,
if you strike mail, it's
you
only
get
1
one.
point.
And so the whole thing is kind of a game of...
And everyone was there with their own personal armor, so everyone's armor setup was a little bit different.
Yeah, so you have all these kind of different historical models of armor.
Yeah, they weren't all uniform, so how you were trying to attack one guy would vary from how you tried to attack the next guy.
Which would suggest that the easiest way to win would be to go buy some late 16th century Maximilian armor, because then you're just, as I like to put it, you're a giant lobster at that point, and there's very, very few places you can get in, but...
I think if you're the kind of guy who can spend the money on that type of armor, then go for it.
They were extremely skilled. It's hard to tell because you see a lot of points that seem to go, or thrust to go awry, but it's amazing how quickly someone can kind of get under the armor. It just shows you know, how dangerous it even was, even when you're still in a full suit of armor.
Well, sure, because at one point, Jake, who actually won this particular tournament, he actually broke his spear over top of the other guy's head. Yeah, because they were going at it that hard.
That was like one of the few times I wasn't recording, and yeah, they broke one of the spears just right over the head. Crack. That says a lot. The person was actually okay in that armor as well, but yeah, and they were like, oh, well, and they kind of set those spears aside and pull out some new ones. Yeah, there was actually a couple of funny things that happened, that neither of which I got recorded. I know of one that was recorded, although it won't be in our videos because I don't have it, but also where they were hugging at the end in full armor. They were like, oh, and then their faceplates got stuck together and they couldn't, it was like, and kiss, because they couldn't move. It was really pretty entertaining. But yeah, the fighting there, it's more interesting to watch from, I think, less from a martial standpoint and more from kind of just trying to understand what it could have looked like historically, especially when they were going in there half swording, because they're really treating the sword like a spear. That's the intention. Yeah. And it was really interesting to watch how they did the fights and how quickly, again, you know, they could get that point into a little gap in the armor and win that one little point. It was also very fascinating looking at all the armor setups that people did have. Some really impressive designs. Very much a superhero theme going on, because there was both an Iron Man and a Captain America. And so it was like, well, we hope that those two will fight at some point. We will get the HEMA Marvel Civil War there going. Yeah, it was pretty funny, but. I really found that with both Harnischfechten and with Ringen, two things that I don't do. I was like, man, I kind of really want to go do those things. I think I'll hold off on at least the more expensive one for now, because getting full armor that fits you properly is really expensive. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to watch, and I'm glad they did both of these, because these are kind of more subtle parts of HEMA. I think rapiers and longswords are going to draw people in more. One is a smaller subset because it's armor. I think a lot of people have that as a draw, but it's a smaller group, so you're not going to have as nearly a larger tournament. And the other one is wrestling, and most people would just kind of set that to the side and not think about it. But both are take incredible amounts of skill and are, again, just as martially valid. You just have to figure out how to do it. So for me, that was some of the most entertaining bouts to watch, because I didn't really know what to expect with those, nearly as much as I would with rapier and longsword and those type of things. So yeah, very interesting to watch, very fun fights, and certainly not the biggest draw for Longpoint, but still very interesting. But yeah, next up we will talk about some of the other types of weapons we saw tournaments for. So hold on and stay tuned for that video coming out soon.